Holidays change the way time feels. Days become less rigid. Schedules soften. Ordinary routines loosen just enough to feel restful, without disappearing entirely. In late April of 2007, that familiar holiday rhythm settled over Praia de Luz, a small resort town along Portugal's southern coast. Praia de Luz was quiet by design. It was not built for nightlife or crowds. It catered to families, particularly those with young children. Low-rise apartment blocks sat along gently sloping streets. Paths connected restaurants, pools, and residential units. The sea lay just beyond, visible but not overwhelming. For visitors, the appeal was simple. It felt contained, predictable, safe. People chose Praia de Luz precisely because it did not feel chaotic. Children played openly. Parents walked between apartments and restaurants without concern. Evenings arrived without urgency. On April 28th, the McCann family arrived. Kate and Jerry McCann were both medical doctors living in the United Kingdom. Their lives at home were structured around demanding careers, long hours, and the constant balancing act familiar to working parents. This holiday had been planned carefully. They were traveling with their 3 children, twins Sean and Amelie, just under 2 years old, and their eldest daughter, Madeleine, who was nearly 4. They were not alone. A group of friends, many of whom were also doctors, many with young children, were staying nearby. The intention was to holiday together, sharing meals and time while still maintaining their own family routines. The McCanns were staying in a ground floor apartment within the Ocean Club Resort. The layout was practical. The apartment opened onto a small patio area at the front, which faced a pedestrian walkway. From there, paths led toward the resort's restaurants and communal spaces. The back of the apartment overlooked a quieter service area. Inside, the apartment was simple and functional. A small kitchen, a living area, bedrooms branching off a short hallway. There was nothing unusual about the space, nothing that suggested danger. In the days leading up to May 3rd, the family settled into a familiar holiday rhythm. Mornings were spent around the resort. The children attended organized activities. Afternoons were relaxed, swimming, resting, playing. Evenings followed a predictable pattern. Dinner was eaten with friends at one of the nearby restaurants. The children were bathed and put to bed. Parents returned periodically to check on them. This routine was not improvised. It was discussed and agreed upon within the group. The restaurant chosen for evening meals was close enough to allow parents to walk back to their apartments easily. The distance was short, the path well lit, the area familiar. Other families around them followed similar practices. Parents checked on sleeping children. Friends kept informal watch over one another's routines. This was not unusual in the context of the resort. The environment encouraged a sense of shared safety. On the afternoon of May 3rd, nothing about the day felt different. Madeleine played as she usually did. She was described by those who knew her as outgoing, confident, and expressive. She spoke easily with adults. She enjoyed routine, but she was also curious, eager to engage with the world around her. The twins followed their own rhythm: naps, meals, quiet play. As evening approached, preparations were made for dinner. Kate and Jerry McCann bathed the children. Pajamas were put on. Stories were read. Lights were dimmed. The children were settled into bed. Madeleine lay in the same room as her younger siblings. Her bed was positioned near the door. The twins slept in cots nearby. There were no signs of distress. Madeleine did not resist bedtime. She did not express fear. She did not ask to stay awake. Later, Kate McCann would describe the moment as entirely ordinary, a routine ending to an ordinary day. The bedroom door was closed. The parents left the apartment. They joined their friends at the restaurant. The atmosphere there was relaxed. Food was ordered. Conversation flowed easily. Nothing about the evening felt tense. Time passed without urgency. As planned, checks on the children were carried out. The first check occurred not long after dinner began. The apartment was quiet. All 3 children were asleep. Nothing appeared disturbed. The check was brief. The door was closed again. The parent returned to the restaurant. This pattern continued. Each check reinforced the same expectation. The children were sleeping. The apartment remained quiet. Nothing had changed. No one reported seeing unfamiliar individuals near the apartment. No disturbance was noted in the surrounding area. The resort maintained its calm evening rhythm. Lights glowed softly in windows. People moved along paths casually. This sense of normality matters. There was no escalation, no warning sign, no interruption. The environment did not signal danger. At some point later in the evening, another check was planned. It was intended to be routine. Another short walk, another quiet room, another confirmation that everything was as it should be. The assumption, shared by everyone, was that the night would continue the way it had begun. Calm, contained, unremarkable. What followed would change how every moment of that evening was remembered. But until that moment arrived, nothing stood out. As the evening settled in, time moved without urgency. Dinner continued at the restaurant. Plates were cleared. Drinks were refilled. Conversation drifted easily from one topic to another. The adults spoke about their days, about their children, about plans for the remainder of the holiday. Nothing about the atmosphere suggested concern. The routine of checking on the children had already proven reassuring. The first visit back to the apartment had confirmed what everyone expected. 3 children asleep, a quiet room, no disturbance. The walk between the restaurant and the apartment was short. It took only a few minutes. The path was familiar and open, passing other apartments and shared spaces. Lighting along the route was soft but sufficient. People could see one another moving about, though by this point in the evening, foot traffic had thinned. The sense of safety was reinforced by familiarity. The same paths were walked night after night. The same routine repeated. The checks were not framed as security sweeps. They were simple confirmations. A door opened, a glance inside, a quiet room. Each time, the outcome was the same. The children slept. Madeleine lay in her bed. The twins remained undisturbed in their cots. There were no signs of movement, no indication that anyone had entered the apartment. The bedroom window was closed. The door remained as it had been left. The assumption was straightforward. If something were wrong, it would be obvious. Crying, noise, disruption, none of those signs appeared. As the evening progressed, checks continued at intervals. Different members of the group took responsibility at different times. Each visit confirmed the same scene. The routine held. The Ocean Club resort itself contributed to this sense of reassurance. It was designed for families. Children moved freely during the day. Parents gathered in shared spaces. Staff were visible throughout the complex. At night, the resort did not become empty. Lights remained on in common areas. People walked between apartments and restaurants. The space did not feel isolated. The McCann apartment, in particular, was not hidden. It sat along a pedestrian route. People passed by regularly during the day, and occasionally in the evening. From the front patio, one could see the walkway. From the rear, the apartment backed onto a quieter area used by staff. There was no sense of seclusion. This mattered deeply to how the parents assessed risk. The idea that someone could enter the apartment unnoticed did not align with their understanding of the environment. In retrospect, much attention would be paid to the physical layout. The doors, the windows, the distance between the apartment and the restaurant. But in that moment, these details felt neutral. They were part of the background. As the night moved on, conversation at the restaurant continued. The adults were relaxed. No one was watching the clock closely. The checks were spaced comfortably. No one expressed worry. This rhythm of reassurance continued until later in the evening. At a certain point, another check was scheduled. It was expected to be identical to the ones before it. The same quiet walk, the same sleeping children, the same return to the table. Nothing about the plan had changed. Nothing about the environment had shifted. The assumption of safety remained intact. When the parent responsible for that check left the restaurant, there was no urgency. It was simply part of the routine. The path was quiet. Lights glowed softly in nearby apartments. The air was calm. Inside the apartment, the expectation was clear. 3 children asleep. A quiet room. No surprises. The door to the apartment was opened. The bedroom door was approached. This time, what was found did not match expectation. Madeleine was not in her bed. At first, the absence was confusing rather than alarming. The twins were still asleep. The room was quiet. There was no sign of struggle. No noise. The bed where Madeleine should have been was empty. The immediate response was disbelief. Children move in their sleep. They climb into other beds. They wander briefly. The assumption was that Madeleine must be somewhere nearby. A quick search of the apartment followed. The living area, the bathroom, the patio. She was not there. The door to the bedroom window was open. The shutter had been raised. This detail stood out immediately. It had not been open earlier. Concern sharpened rapidly. The calm of the evening fractured. What had been routine seconds before now felt urgent. The parent ran back toward the restaurant. The message was simple and immediate. Madeleine was missing. The atmosphere at the table changed instantly. Conversation stopped. People stood. Questions were asked, but there were no answers yet. The adults moved quickly toward the apartment. Searches began immediately. The area around the apartment was checked. Paths were scanned. Nearby spaces were searched. The assumption shifted. This was no longer a child wandering within a familiar space. This was an absence that did not resolve itself. Staff were alerted. Other guests became aware that something was wrong. The resort, moments earlier calm and quiet, began to fill with movement. Lights were turned on. Voices rose, not in panic yet, but in urgency. People called Madeleine's name. Paths were searched again. Doors were knocked on. No one reported seeing her. The night deepened. The sense of containment that had defined the evening dissolved. What had felt safe moments earlier now felt uncertain. Time began to move differently. Minutes stretched. Actions overlapped. Everyone focused on the same question. Where was Madeleine? The answer did not come. Once the realization took hold, the evening no longer moved in a straight line. What followed felt fractured. Adults moved quickly between locations. Voices overlapped. Questions were asked before answers could form. The apartment was searched again. Every room, every corner, every space where a child might hide or wander. Madeleine was not there. The twins slept on, undisturbed by the movement around them. This detail was both grounding and unsettling. Nothing about the room suggested a struggle. Beds were neat. Objects were in place. There were no signs of disruption. Yet Madeleine was gone. Attention turned outward. The patio area was checked again. The walkway beyond it was scanned. People moved in both directions along the paths, calling her name. Lights were turned on in nearby apartments. Guests emerged, drawn by the urgency in voices and movement. Staff were alerted. The resort manager was contacted. The assumption at first was still hopeful. Children can move quickly. They can wander without understanding distance or danger. The belief was that Madeleine might be nearby, a neighboring apartment, a common area, a place she had been during the day. Search efforts expanded rapidly. The area around the apartment was covered repeatedly. Paths leading away from the resort were checked. People spread out instinctively, without formal coordination. The environment that had felt contained earlier now felt open and uncertain. As minutes passed without success, concern escalated into fear. The possibility that Madeleine had not simply wandered began to settle. Police were contacted. Local authorities arrived. They gathered initial information. When had Madeleine last been seen? Who had checked on her? What doors and windows had been open? These questions were asked quickly, amid movement and confusion. Answers were given as clearly as possible, but memory was already shifting. Details that had seemed insignificant moments earlier now carried weight. Times, intervals, observations. The bedroom window drew attention. It was open, the shutter raised. This was not how it had been left. The possibility of entry from outside could not be dismissed. Search efforts intensified. More people joined. The surrounding streets were checked. Vehicles were noted. The sense of urgency sharpened. The calm of the resort was gone. In its place was motion. Lights were bright. Voices carried through the night air. The sense of safety that had defined the evening had collapsed. This transition from routine to alarm was abrupt. There had been no warning, no gradual shift. One moment, the evening had been ordinary. The next, it had become something else entirely. Police began organizing search areas. They gathered descriptions. They documented clothing. They took statements. The reality of the situation settled heavily. A child was missing. Time mattered. The initial hours were critical. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to mix with adrenaline. People searched the same areas repeatedly, hoping something had been missed. Every shadow drew attention. Every sound caused heads to turn. Madeleine did not appear. The apartment remained the center of activity. It was examined again. Details were noted, but clarity did not arrive. As midnight approached, the understanding deepened. This was not a momentary absence. This was not a misunderstanding that would resolve itself quietly. The evening that had begun with familiar routines now carried a weight that would not lift. The ordinary had ended. What lay ahead would be shaped by uncertainty and by waiting. The first chapter of the story closed there, not with resolution, but with a break, a moment when routine gave way to something irreversible. When a routine breaks suddenly, the mind searches backward. It tries to locate the last point of certainty, the last moment when everything was still intact. For the people gathered that night in Praia de Luz, that backward search began almost immediately. Questions formed quickly. When had Madeleine last been seen? Who had checked on her last? What time had that been? The answers mattered now, in a way they never had before. Earlier in the evening, the checks on the children had followed a familiar rhythm. Each visit to the apartment had reinforced the same understanding. The children were asleep. The room was quiet. Nothing appeared disturbed. One of those checks, carried out earlier in the evening, had included a brief glance into the bedroom where Madeleine slept alongside the twins. She had been in her bed, asleep, covered. That moment became a reference point, a fixed anchor in time. After that check, the adults had returned to the restaurant. Conversation resumed. Time passed. Another check was scheduled later, as part of the same routine. Between those two moments, the last confirmed sighting and the discovery of absence, lay the window that would define the case. At first, that window felt small, minutes perhaps, but as details were examined, it became clear that certainty did not extend as far as anyone wished. Checks were not timed precisely to the minute. They were spaced naturally, based on conversation and comfort. People did not look at watches with forensic precision. They looked into rooms. They listened for sound. They confirmed presence. This meant that the exact moment Madeleine left her bed could not be pinpointed. Only the boundaries could be established. She had been present at one check. She was absent at the next. Everything that happened in between existed in uncertainty. This uncertainty became central. Investigators would later refer to it as the window of opportunity, the time frame during which Madeleine could have left the apartment or been taken from it. In the immediate aftermath, however, these distinctions were not yet formalized. The focus remained on searching, on finding, on bringing her back. But even in those first hours, people began to retrace steps. The path between the restaurant and the apartment was walked again. Slowly, deliberately, people looked for anything out of place. A dropped item, a sound, a person remembered passing by. Nothing stood out. Guests were questioned. Had anyone seen a child walking alone? Had anyone heard crying? Had anyone noticed a stranger? No one reported anything definitive. This absence of observation added to the confusion. The resort was not isolated. People had been moving about. Lights had been on, yet no one recalled seeing Madeleine. The apartment itself became the center of focus. Police examined the bedroom. The open window was noted again. The shutter had been raised. The bed was undisturbed. There were no obvious signs of struggle. No noise had been reported. The lack of disturbance was striking. Children rarely leave their beds quietly in the night. And yet, the scene suggested exactly that, or something equally silent. The idea that Madeleine might have woken and wandered out alone was considered. She was nearly 4. She could walk. She could open doors. But the layout of the apartment complicated this theory. To leave through the front patio door, she would have had to open it, step outside, and move into the pedestrian area. To leave through the bedroom window, she would have had to climb out. Neither option fit neatly with what was observed. Still, in the early hours, no possibility was dismissed. Search teams expanded. The area around the resort was divided informally. People moved outward in widening circles. Streets were checked, alleyways scanned, bins opened, cars were inspected. The surrounding neighborhood was quieter than usual at that hour. Lights flicked on as residents became aware of the search. Some joined in, others watched from doorways. The sense of urgency deepened as time passed. Each minute without success felt heavier. Police gathered statements. They asked the parents to recount the evening again. What time had dinner begun? Who had checked on the children, and when? What exactly had been seen? These questions were asked calmly, but firmly. Details were written down. Times approximated. Memory was already being shaped by stress. This was unavoidable. The last confirmed sighting of Madeleine remained fixed earlier in the evening. After that, the timeline blurred. What was clear was this: Madeleine had disappeared without sound, without witnesses, without immediate explanation. As the night progressed into early morning, the search continued. Resources increased. More officers arrived. Coordination improved. But answers did not. The window of absence remained open, wide enough to contain multiple possibilities, narrow enough to resist clarity. And as dawn approached, one thing became certain. Whatever had happened to Madeleine had occurred quietly and quickly. The night had absorbed it, continuing cleanly in sequence and exactly to the locked rules. Once police were formally involved, the night shifted again. What had begun as a frantic, informal search took on a more structured shape. Officers asked people to slow down, to focus, to move methodically. The resort grounds were divided into areas. Paths were retraced. Rooms were checked again. The intention was simple. Nothing should be missed. Statements were taken as soon as possible. Parents were asked to recount the evening in sequence. Who checked on the children first? Who checked next? Approximately what time each visit occurred. These accounts were written down. Times were estimated. The difficulty of this task was immediate. The evening had not been structured around exact minutes. People had not looked at clocks. They had followed instinct and routine. Now, those approximations mattered. Investigators listened carefully. They asked follow-up questions. They clarified details where possible. But certainty was limited. The bedroom window remained a focal point. Officers examined the frame. They noted the raised shutter. They looked at the area beneath the window. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no damage to the surrounding structure. The absence of disturbance complicated interpretation. If someone had entered or exited through the window. They had done so quietly. If Madeleine had climbed out herself, she had done so without leaving clear trace. Both possibilities were unsettling. Search efforts extended beyond the immediate resort grounds. Officers canvassed nearby streets. They checked parked vehicles. They asked residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Most had not. Some reported hearing voices, but voices were common that night. People were outside. Movement was not unusual. What mattered was specificity. No one could offer a clear sighting. As hours passed, the sense of urgency did not diminish. It intensified. Police contacted regional authorities. Resources were increased. The understanding was clear. The first hours after a disappearance are critical. Every minute matters. The possibility that Madeleine was still nearby remained alive. Search teams moved outward. The coastline was considered. Paths leading away from the resort were examined. Dark areas were illuminated. Names were called repeatedly. Still nothing emerged. Inside the apartment, officers continued their examination. They documented the layout. They noted the positions of furniture. They recorded the condition of doors and windows. The bedroom where the children slept was photographed. Attention was paid to the beds, the covers, the spacing. The twins remained asleep through much of the activity. They were later moved to another location. This decision was practical. The apartment had become a focal point. It could no longer function as a family space. As dawn approached, fatigue began to set in. But sleep was not possible. Parents, friends, and police remained alert. Hope persisted. The belief that Madeleine could still be found alive drove every action. As morning light began to soften the darkness, the search entered a new phase. What had been a nighttime response became a daytime operation. The area around Praia de Luz was examined again, now with visibility. People who had slept through the night emerged to find the town changed. The calm resort atmosphere was gone. In its place was activity. Police vehicles, search teams, media arriving. News of the disappearance spread quickly. What had been a local emergency became an international story. But in those first hours, before the full weight of attention arrived, the focus remained singular. Find the child. The window of absence remained open. Time continued to pass, and with each passing hour, the questions grew heavier. As the sky began to lighten, the night released its hold on Praia de Luz. Darkness gave way slowly, almost reluctantly. Shadows softened, edges became clearer. Details emerged that had been hidden hours earlier. For those searching, the arrival of daylight brought both relief and dread. Relief because visibility returned. Dread because nothing had changed. Madeleine had not been found. The early morning hours marked a shift. What had begun as a desperate attempt to recover a missing child during the night now became a sustained investigation. Police adjusted their approach. Search areas were expanded formally. Maps were drawn. Teams were assigned. The assumption that Madeleine might be nearby remained, but it was now tempered by time. The window of absence, once measured in minutes, had stretched into hours. As daylight settled fully, the resort revealed itself again. Paths looked ordinary. Apartment buildings appeared unchanged. The same spaces that had felt safe days earlier now carried a different weight. Every doorway seemed significant. Every corner held possibility. Officers spoke again with resort staff. They reviewed staff movements during the evening and night. Who had been working? Who had finished shifts? Who had been present in shared areas? Nothing emerged immediately. Guests were questioned once more. Some provided details they had not thought relevant earlier. A passing figure, a sound in the distance, a moment that stood out only in hindsight. But none of these details formed a clear picture. The apartment remained central. Investigators returned to it repeatedly. They examined the bedroom window again. They considered angles, access points, and sightlines. They noted the absence of disturbance. This continued to trouble those involved. Disappearances rarely occur without sound or trace, and yet this one appeared to have done exactly that. As the morning progressed, senior officers arrived. The seriousness of the situation was fully acknowledged. This was no longer treated as a brief absence or a misunderstanding. This was a missing child case. Resources were escalated. Search dogs were requested. Helicopters were considered. The surrounding area, including open land, roads, and coastal paths, became part of the search. By late morning, media presence had increased significantly. Reporters arrived with cameras. News vehicles lined nearby streets. The story spread quickly beyond Portugal. The image of Madeleine McCann was broadcast widely. A photograph of a smiling child with blonde hair and large eyes became instantly recognizable. The case crossed borders. Attention intensified. With it came pressure. Investigators were now operating under public scrutiny. Every decision would be observed. Every statement would be analyzed. Inside the McCann family's world, time felt suspended. They answered questions repeatedly. They retraced the evening again and again. They searched the same mental paths, hoping to find something they had missed. The uncertainty was overwhelming. The last confirmed sighting of Madeleine remained fixed in the past. After that, there was only absence. As the day wore on, it became clear that the initial window, the brief period during which Madeleine might have been found nearby, was closing, not because hope had disappeared, but because probability had shifted. The search continued, but the understanding deepened. This was no longer a matter of minutes. The case had entered a different phase. The night of May 3rd had ended, but it had left something behind. a gap in time that could not be filled, a moment that resisted reconstruction. The window of absence closed quietly, without ceremony, and in its place emerged something larger, an investigation that would stretch across years, across borders, across public consciousness. The ordinary evening was now fully behind them. What lay ahead would be shaped by uncertainty, scrutiny, and waiting. By the time the morning fully settled over Praia de Luz, the disappearance had crossed a threshold. What began as a frantic search, driven by instinct, was now a formal investigation. Police presence increased. Uniformed officers were joined by investigators in plain clothes. Senior officials arrived to assess the situation. Decisions were made about jurisdiction, resources, and next steps. The apartment where Madeleine had last been seen became the center of attention. It was secured more formally. Movement in and out was controlled. Photographs were taken. Notes were made. Details that had felt incidental during the night were now recorded with care. Investigators approached the scene with urgency, but also with limitation. Portugal's missing child procedures at the time differed from those in some other countries. There was no immediate assumption of abduction. Cases were assessed cautiously. Possibilities remained open. The idea that Madeleine might have wandered away had not yet been ruled out. This shaped early decisions. Search efforts remained focused on the surrounding area. Officers and volunteers continued to check streets, open land, and nearby structures. Dogs were introduced to the search. Handlers moved slowly, methodically. They followed paths that radiated outward from the apartment. The coastline drew attention. Cliffs, beaches, and access routes were examined. The terrain was uneven in places, with drops and natural barriers. The possibility of an accident was considered alongside other explanations. At the same time, investigators began assembling a clearer timeline. Statements were reviewed. Times were compared. The sequence of evening checks was examined carefully. Each person who had checked on the children was asked to describe exactly what they had seen. Who had entered the bedroom? Who had looked inside? What position Madeleine had been in? These recollections became foundational. But memory, even under calm circumstances, is imperfect. Under stress, it shifts. Investigators were aware of this. They asked clarifying questions. They sought consistency where possible. They documented uncertainty where it remained. The bedroom window continued to draw focus. Its position, the raised shutter, the lack of disturbance, these details did not point clearly in any single direction. They suggested possibility without certainty. Investigators examined access points. They considered sightlines from the walkway outside. They evaluated whether someone passing could see into the room. They measured distances. Nothing conclusively explained how Madeleine had disappeared. This ambiguity shaped the early phase of the case. There was no clear narrative yet, only fragments. As the day progressed, the media presence expanded rapidly. News of the disappearance spread across Portugal and beyond. International outlets began to report on the case. Cameras appeared near the resort. Questions were asked publicly. This attention introduced a new pressure. Investigators were now working under observation. Decisions were scrutinized in real time. Statements were replayed and analyzed. This dynamic would influence the case deeply as time went on. Within the McCann family's immediate circle, focus remained on cooperation. Kate and Jerry McCann spoke with police repeatedly. They answered questions. They revisited the timeline again and again. They expressed disbelief and fear. They requested that the search continue without pause. Friends who had been with them that evening were also questioned. Their accounts were gathered carefully. The consistency between statements was noted. Differences were examined. But again, nothing provided a definitive answer. The early investigation unfolded in layers. Search efforts continued on the ground. Administrative processes expanded. Communication with regional and national authorities increased. As hours turned into days, the understanding deepened. This case would not resolve quickly. The disappearance of a child in a foreign country, under international scrutiny, presented unique challenges. Language barriers, legal differences, media pressure, all of these factors intersected. Investigators worked to maintain control of the process. They balanced urgency with caution. They avoided public speculation. They focused on gathering information. Yet, despite sustained effort, clarity did not emerge. No confirmed sightings, no definitive evidence explaining the disappearance. The early investigation had established the boundaries of what was known. Madeleine had been present earlier in the evening. She was absent later. The apartment showed no clear signs of struggle. Everything beyond that remained uncertain. As the days progressed, this uncertainty would harden into something else. Suspicion, debate, division. But in these early hours, the case was still fluid, still open, still defined by the hope that answers might yet be found. As the investigation moved beyond its first day, attention turned increasingly toward process. What evidence existed, how it had been collected, what could reasonably be inferred. The apartment was examined in greater detail. Officers documented the condition of doors, windows, and shutters. They recorded measurements. They photographed entry points. The goal was not yet to confirm a theory, but to understand what was physically possible. The bedroom where the children had slept remained central. The bedclothes were inspected. The positioning of furniture was noted. Investigators looked for anything that might suggest movement during the night, but the room remained largely undisturbed. This absence of disruption complicated interpretation. In cases of forced entry, signs are often obvious. Here there were none. Attention turned to forensic testing. At the time, forensic capabilities were more limited than they would become in later years. Still, samples were collected. Items were sent for analysis. Investigators hoped to find something that would anchor the case. A trace, a marker, a signal that would narrow the range of possibilities. Results did not arrive quickly, and when they did not bring immediate clarity. As the days passed, investigators began considering broader possibilities. Abduction was not assumed initially, but as searches yielded no results, it became increasingly difficult to explain Madeleine's disappearance without outside involvement. The absence of sightings, the lack of noise, the controlled nature of the apartment, these elements shifted attention subtly. At the same time, police examined activity around the resort. They looked at known offenders in the region. They reviewed reports of suspicious behavior. They asked whether anyone unfamiliar had been seen near the apartments. Some individuals were noted. Descriptions were vague. No clear suspect emerged. Media pressure intensified. News outlets demanded updates. Commentators speculated openly. The story began to evolve in public space faster than it did in official channels. This created tension. Investigators worked under scrutiny while trying to avoid premature conclusions. Statements made early were revisited repeatedly by journalists. Minor inconsistencies were amplified. Details that had not seemed significant were pulled into focus. Within the investigation, this dynamic required careful management. Officers limited public communication. They focused on internal review. They continued gathering information quietly. Kate and Jerry McCann remained cooperative. They participated in interviews. They revisited timelines. They answered the same questions multiple times. Their accounts were compared against those of others present that evening. Investigators noted both consistencies and uncertainties. Again, nothing definitive emerged. As days turned into weeks, the investigation widened further. International cooperation increased. British authorities became involved. Information was shared across borders. This coordination brought resources, but also complexity. Different legal systems, different investigative norms. Decisions required careful navigation. The case was no longer local. It was international. With that shift came heightened pressure. Every action was now observed by multiple audiences. Public patience began to thin. Speculation filled gaps left by silence. The absence of answers created space for theories. Some were grounded in evidence. Others were not. Investigators remained cautious. They understood that once a narrative took hold publicly, it could shape perception permanently. Still, the lack of resolution weighed heavily. Evidence did not point cleanly in any one direction. Searches continued. Reviews were conducted. Nothing yielded the clarity everyone sought. The early investigation had now settled into a difficult reality. The case was active, but uncertain. The facts established so far were few. Madeleine had disappeared quietly. The apartment showed no clear signs of intrusion. Search efforts had not located her. Everything else remained open. This uncertainty would soon shift the tone of the case. As pressure mounted, the investigation would begin to change, not because of new evidence, but because of the weight of time. As the investigation moved into its second and third weeks, something subtle began to change. Not in the evidence, not in what was known, but in the atmosphere surrounding the case. The disappearance had become impossible to separate from the attention it attracted. News coverage expanded rapidly. Television crews remained stationed near Praia de Luz. Newspapers published daily updates. Online forums and discussion boards began to fill with commentary. The case was no longer unfolding quietly behind closed doors. It was unfolding in public. Investigators continued their work, but now every action existed alongside speculation. Every statement was parsed. Every pause was interpreted. Silence itself became a subject of debate. This created pressure, not only on the police, but on everyone connected to the case. Kate and Jerry McCann were now speaking not only to investigators, but to the world. They appealed publicly for information. They asked anyone who might have seen something to come forward. These appeals were broadcast widely. Posters bearing Madeleine's image appeared across Portugal and beyond. The image became familiar almost instantly. A child's face, frozen in time. As public attention grew, the investigation entered a new phase. Investigators began to revisit earlier assumptions more critically. They reviewed statements again. They examined the sequence of checks with greater scrutiny. They compared recollections across multiple interviews. Small discrepancies, common under stress, were noted. Individually, they did not mean much. Collectively, they added complexity. This is often how investigations evolve, not through sudden discovery, but through gradual reevaluation. At the same time, forensic results continued to arrive slowly. Some findings were inconclusive. Others raised questions without providing answers. None delivered the clarity that would definitively anchor the case. The lack of resolution created a vacuum, and vacuums tend to fill. Public opinion began to divide. Some believed the disappearance was the result of an opportunistic abduction. Others questioned decisions made that evening. The tone of coverage shifted. What had begun as sympathy and concern slowly became scrutiny. Investigators were aware of this shift. They understood that public pressure could not be ignored, but also could not be allowed to dictate conclusions. Balancing these forces became increasingly difficult. Within the investigation, attention narrowed. Certain possibilities were explored more deeply. This did not mean others were dismissed, but resources are finite. Focus matters. As time passed, investigators examined the actions and decisions of everyone present that evening with greater intensity. This included the parents. This shift was not unusual in missing child cases. When external evidence is limited, investigators often turn inward. They re-examine routines. They question assumptions. They test explanations against available facts. This process does not imply guilt. It reflects the absence of alternative leads. But in the public eye, nuance is easily lost. As investigative focus shifted, media narratives followed. Headlines changed. Questions were framed differently. The case began to feel less like a mystery waiting to be solved, and more like a debate. This transformation had consequences. It affected how information was interpreted, how statements were received, how silence was perceived. The early investigation, once defined by urgency and hope, now carried an additional weight. Expectation. Investigators continued working. They conducted further interviews. They coordinated with international partners. They reviewed data again and again. But certainty remained elusive. The disappearance resisted simple explanation. By this point, it was clear that the case would not resolve quickly. The early phase, defined by immediate response and search, had ended. What followed would be shaped by time, by media, by scrutiny, and by the enduring absence at the center of the story. The investigation had taken shape, but it had also taken on a life of its own, one that would continue to evolve for years. There is a moment in some investigations when the case no longer belongs only to those working on it. That moment arrived quietly, not with a single headline, not with a formal announcement. It arrived as attention multiplied. By the time weeks had passed since Madeleine McCann disappeared, the case had moved far beyond Praia de Luz. What had begun as a local emergency had become an international story. Television networks across Europe and beyond dedicated airtime to updates. Newspapers printed daily articles. Online spaces filled with discussion. The case now existed simultaneously in multiple places, in police files, in newsrooms, and in the minds of people who had never set foot in Portugal. This expansion changed everything. Media coverage intensified in both volume and tone. Early reports had focused on the search, on appeals for information, on the image of a missing child. As time passed without resolution, the narrative shifted. Questions replaced updates. Analysis replaced appeals. Speculation filled the gaps left by uncertainty. This shift was gradual, but unmistakable. The story was no longer just about finding Madeleine. It was about explaining how she had vanished. And when explanations were scarce, attention turned inward. The actions of those closest to the case were examined with increasing scrutiny. Kate and Jerry McCann remained highly visible. They continued to speak publicly. They gave interviews. They appealed directly to the public for information. Their visibility was intentional. They believed that attention increased the chances of someone coming forward. But visibility has consequences. Every word spoken publicly is recorded. Every expression is analyzed. Every pause is interpreted. Public perception began to fracture. Some people expressed sympathy and support. Others questioned decisions made on the night Madeleine disappeared. These questions were not confined to online spaces. They appeared in mainstream media. Articles began to explore the evening's routine. The practice of leaving children asleep in an apartment while dining nearby became a focal point. For some, it was understandable in the context of the resort. For others, it became difficult to accept. The nuance of environment and routine was often lost in broader debate. Media outlets, competing for attention, framed the story in increasingly simplified terms. Complexity does not always translate easily into headlines. As a result, certain elements were repeated again and again. The open window, the timing of checks, the absence of noise. These details became symbols. They were discussed out of proportion to what they could definitively explain. Investigators continued their work quietly, but the public conversation grew louder. In some cases, speculation outran evidence. The distinction between confirmed fact and theory blurred. This environment made investigation more difficult. Witnesses became hesitant. Information shared publicly could influence memory. People questioned whether what they remembered was what they had seen or what they had later heard described. The case had entered a feedback loop. Media shaped perception. Perception influenced interpretation. Interpretation fed further coverage. Time passed. Months turned into years. The investigation did not stop, but it slowed. Not because of lack of effort, but because of lack of answers. As time moved forward, the absence of resolution became its own narrative. The question shifted again. Not just what happened, but why nothing had been resolved. This question carried its own weight. It fostered frustration. It invited criticism. It encouraged the idea that someone, somewhere, must know more than they were saying. Public suspicion deepened. Investigative decisions were revisited repeatedly in commentary. Early missteps, real or perceived, were magnified. Actions taken under pressure were judged with the benefit of hindsight. This is a common pattern in long-running cases. Time creates distance. Distance creates reinterpretation. As years passed, the McCann case became more than a disappearance. It became a reference point, a case people compared others to, a symbol of unresolved loss. The image of Madeleine remained constant. Her face appeared on posters long after other stories faded. This persistence kept the case alive, but it also froze it in time. The child did not age in public memory. The story did not progress in a linear way. It circled, revisiting the same details, re-examining the same moments. The investigation itself continued, but often out of public view. Police reviewed information. Leads were followed. Files were revisited. But progress was incremental, and incremental progress rarely satisfies public expectation. As the years went on, the case became layered. The original disappearance, the early investigation, the media response, the public debate. Each layer added complexity, and with complexity came distortion. The story people believed they knew was not always the story investigators were working through. This gap between perception and process would continue to shape the case for years. The passage of time did not quiet the story. It reshaped it. As the months passed without resolution, the investigation entered a more difficult phase. Searches had been conducted. Evidence had been collected. Leads had been followed. Yet the central question remained unanswered. Madeleine McCann had vanished without explanation. In cases where evidence is limited, attention often turns inward. This is not unusual. Investigators reassess what they know. They re-examine early assumptions. They scrutinize timelines with greater intensity. In the McCann case, this process unfolded under intense public observation. Every development was reported. Every change in tone was noticed. Within the investigation, focus narrowed. Officers revisited the events of the evening again, not because they believed answers had been missed intentionally, but because unanswered questions demanded further examination. The routine that had once seemed ordinary now felt fragile under scrutiny. The timing of checks, the layout of the apartment, the open window, these elements were examined repeatedly. As part of this process, the legal status of individuals involved in the case changed. Kate and Jerry McCann were formally designated as arguidos, a Portuguese legal term indicating a person of interest in an investigation. This designation did not mean they were charged. It did not imply guilt. It signaled that investigators required formal cooperation and legal protection for questioning. In Portugal, this status allows individuals to be questioned with legal representation present. But outside the legal system, nuance was lost. Headlines simplified the designation. Public interpretation shifted sharply. Suspicion became louder. Media narratives framed the change as a turning point. Questions that had once been asked quietly were now asked openly. Public debate intensified. Some viewed the development as a natural step in a stalled investigation. Others saw it as evidence of deeper doubt. The distinction between legal procedure and accusation blurred. This shift placed immense pressure on everyone involved. The McCann family found themselves navigating grief, uncertainty, and scrutiny simultaneously. Their actions were observed closely, their words dissected, their silence interpreted. Investigators continued their work. They conducted further interviews. They reviewed forensic results again. They consulted with experts, but progress remained slow. No definitive evidence emerged to support a clear narrative. As time continued to pass, the case became increasingly complex. Legal proceedings unfolded in stages. Statements were taken and retaken. Documents were filed. Challenges were raised. The investigation extended over years rather than months. With time came fatigue. Public attention fluctuated. Some periods brought renewed focus. Others passed quietly, but the underlying uncertainty never resolved. The absence of clear answers created space for alternative explanations. Some theories gained traction, others faded. None were confirmed. This environment, long unresolved and highly visible, altered how the case was perceived. It was no longer just about what happened on one night in May. It was about how the story had unfolded since, about process, about trust, about the limits of investigation. As years went by, official inquiries slowed. The intensity of early efforts was difficult to sustain indefinitely. Resources were allocated elsewhere, but the case was never closed. It remained open, unresolved. The passage of time changed the nature of waiting. Early hope gave way to endurance. Families learned to live alongside uncertainty. The McCann case became part of a broader conversation about missing children, about investigative systems, about media responsibility. It was referenced often, revisited repeatedly. Yet, despite all of this, the core truth remained unchanged. A child had disappeared. No definitive explanation had been established. The story continued to exist in fragments, held together by memory, documentation, and unanswered questions. As time moved forward, the investigation would shift again. New attention would emerge. New reviews would be conducted. But those developments belonged to another chapter. For now, the case existed in a state of suspension, caught between past and future, defined as much by what was unknown as by what was recorded. As time continued to pass, the intensity surrounding the case began to change, not because questions had been answered, but because attention is difficult to sustain indefinitely. The early months had been defined by urgency. Every update had felt critical. Every development carried the possibility of resolution. But as weeks turned into years, the rhythm of coverage slowed. News outlets shifted focus to newer stories. Breaking headlines replaced lingering mysteries. The McCann case did not disappear from public awareness, but it moved into a different category, It became a long-running story, one revisited periodically rather than followed daily. This transition altered how the case was discussed. Coverage became more reflective than reactive. Articles looked back rather than forward. Timelines were summarized. Past decisions were re-examined with the benefit of hindsight. The absence of new information created space for repetition. The same details resurfaced again and again. The open window, the evening checks, the timeline gaps, these elements became fixed reference points. Over time, they hardened into symbols, not because they explained the disappearance, but because they were familiar. Public memory tends to anchor itself to what is most easily recalled. Complex investigations rarely fit neatly into that framework. As a result, nuance faded. The distinction between confirmed facts and unresolved questions blurred further. The case took on a life of its own. It existed in documentaries, books, and discussions. Each retelling emphasized different aspects. Some focused on investigative missteps, others on media influence, others on the emotional toll on the family. None could offer closure. Within law enforcement, the case remained open. Files were reviewed periodically. Information was assessed. But without new evidence, progress was limited. This is a common reality in long-term investigations. Cases do not end simply because time passes, but they do change shape. Resources shift, priorities evolve. The intensity of early effort becomes unsustainable. The McCann family continued to live within this uncertainty. Their lives moved forward in practical ways, but the absence remained constant. They marked birthdays without knowing where Madeleine was. They navigated public life while carrying private grief. The story never fully left them. Public opinion continued to divide. Some people retained strong views. Others disengaged entirely. The case became something people remembered vaguely, rather than followed closely. This fatting of attention brought its own challenges. Without sustained public pressure, investigations risk stagnation. At the same time, constant scrutiny can distort process. The balance is delicate. Too much attention can overwhelm. Too little can allow cases to drift. For years, the McCann case existed in this in-between space. Occasionally, a development would bring it back into focus. A review announced, a new lead mentioned, an official statement released. These moments briefly reignited discussion. Then, gradually, attention softened again. This pattern repeated. The case did not resolve, but it did not disappear. It settled into archives, into memory, into the background of public consciousness. Yet for those closest to it, nothing had changed. Time did not provide answers. It only created distance. As years accumulated, the question of what happened remained as open as it had been at the beginning. The difference was context. The case was now understood not only as a disappearance, but as an example of how investigations, media, and public perception can intertwine over time. This understanding shaped later reviews. It influenced how new information would be approached. It informed how investigators framed future efforts. The story had matured, not toward resolution, but toward complexity. By the end of this period, the McCann case existed as layered history, an original event, an early investigation, an intense media phase, a long stretch of waiting. Each layer carried its own truths, and each layer shaped how the next would unfold. What followed would bring renewed attention, not because the past changed, but because new efforts emerged. Those developments belong to the next chapter. Long-running cases rarely return to public attention suddenly. They resurface gradually. A document reviewed, a question revisited, a detail reconsidered in light of time. For years, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann existed in a quiet state. The case was not closed, but it was not advancing. Files were stored. Information was preserved. The investigation remained officially open, yet inactive in visible ways. What changed was not a single discovery, but the passage of time itself. As years moved on, investigative tools improved. Technology advanced. Techniques that had not existed in 2007 became standard. Digital analysis improved. Data storage expanded. Forensic interpretation became more precise. These changes prompted renewed interest in unresolved cases. Across many jurisdictions, cold cases were re-examined, not because new crimes had occurred, but because old ones could now be seen differently. The McCann case was among those revisited. Investigators reviewed the original files with fresh eyes. They assessed what evidence still existed, what had been tested, what might now be re-examined. This process was methodical and quiet. There were no announcements, no dramatic statements, just careful review. At the same time, public interest had not disappeared entirely. It lingered. Occasional documentaries and articles continued to explore the case. Each new examination brought renewed questions. Could something have been missed? Had early assumptions limited later progress? These questions were not accusations. They were acknowledgments of complexity. In long-running investigations, clarity is often delayed not by inaction, but by limitation. As the case entered its second decade, cooperation between authorities became more structured. British investigators maintained interest. Portuguese authorities retained jurisdiction. Communication between agencies improved. Information sharing became more formalized. This mattered. Cases that cross borders face inherent challenges. Different legal systems, different procedures, different standards of evidence. Time allowed these systems to align more effectively. The review process identified areas where earlier investigation had been constrained. Evidence handling practices in 2007 differed from those of later years. Certain samples had been tested with the best available methods at the time, but those methods had limits. Now, with improved techniques, some material could be reassessed. This did not guarantee answers, but it reopened possibility. Alongside forensic review, investigators revisited witness statements. Memory changes over time, but context also changes. Details that once seemed insignificant can gain meaning later. Investigators looked again at reports of sightings. Descriptions that had been dismissed as vague were reconsidered. Movements near the resort were reevaluated. Again, this process was slow, measured. There was no sudden breakthrough, but momentum returned. The case moved from dormancy to review. Public attention followed cautiously. Announcements were careful. Authorities avoided overstating progress. The lessons of earlier media pressure had been learned. Information was released sparingly. This restraint was deliberate. The goal was not publicity, but precision. As part of renewed focus, investigators also considered patterns. They examined similar crimes. They looked for behavioral consistency across cases. They assessed whether the circumstances of Madeleine's disappearance aligned with known methods. This comparative approach was part of modern investigative practice. It did not replace evidence. It contextualized it. Over time, this re-examination began to narrow focus. Not conclusively, but directionally. Certain possibilities appeared less likely. Others required deeper attention. This shift did not mean resolution was imminent, but it marked a departure from years of stagnation. For the family, renewed focus brought mixed emotion. Hope cautiously held, fatigue deeply felt. Every reopening required revisiting painful ground, but it also reaffirmed that the case had not been forgotten. That effort continued. The story entered a new phase, not defined by urgency, but by patience. The investigation was no longer racing against immediate time. It was moving deliberately, guided by what had been learned over years. This return to the case did not rewrite the past, but it reframed it. What had once seemed fixed was now open to reevaluation. What had been uncertain remained uncertain, but no longer untouched. The ground was being walked again, carefully, quietly. As renewed reviews continued, attention began to coalesce rather than scatter. This did not mean certainty had arrived. It meant that possibilities were being weighed more carefully. Patterns were compared. Information was aligned. What once felt broad began to narrow. A significant shift occurred when German authorities publicly confirmed that they were treating the case as a murder investigation. This announcement marked an important distinction. It did not declare resolution. It did not present final evidence, but it changed the framing. German investigators stated that they believed Madeleine was deceased based on information they had gathered. They also identified a man already known to them in connection with other crimes. This individual had lived in Portugal at the time of Madeleine's disappearance. He had spent time in the Algarve region. He was known to authorities for offenses unrelated to the McCann case. The announcement drew immediate attention. Media coverage intensified once again. Headlines focused on the idea of a suspect, but investigators were careful in their language. They did not name the individual initially. They did not claim that charges were imminent. They did not present a detailed public case. They emphasized the distinction between investigation and proof. This restraint mattered. In long-running cases, public announcements can create false expectation. German authorities avoided that. They asked for information. They appealed for witnesses. They clarified timelines. Their focus was specific. Where had this individual been at certain times? What connections might exist between known movements and the disappearance? The investigation crossed borders once more. Portuguese and British authorities cooperated with German counterparts. Information was shared. Legal frameworks were navigated. This level of coordination reflected lessons learned over years. The case had become truly international. Public reaction was mixed. Some felt renewed hope. Others expressed caution. The history of the case had taught many people to be careful with expectation. Investigators continued working behind the scenes. They reviewed data related to phone records, travel, and known behavior. They examined whether new information aligned with established timelines. They evaluated credibility. Importantly, they did not discard previous work. The renewed focus did not erase earlier investigation. It built upon it. Evidence gathered in 2007 was reassessed in light of later information. This process was incremental. There was no single moment of revelation. Instead, there was accumulation. Small confirmations, eliminations, clarifications. Public statements remained limited. Authorities repeated a central message. The investigation was ongoing. Information was being assessed. No charges had been filed. This careful communication was intentional. It prevented premature conclusions. It protected the integrity of the process. At the same time, the renewed focus reshaped public conversation. The narrative shifted again, from broad speculation to narrower inquiry, from questioning routine decisions to examining specific individuals and movements. This shift did not answer all questions, but it changed where attention rested. For the family, this period carried familiar emotional complexity. Hope resurfaced cautiously, but with it came the knowledge that renewed investigation also meant renewed waiting. Every development required patience. Every announcement carried both promise and restraint. As months passed, updates were sparse. Investigators continued working quietly. Some information remained sealed. Legal processes moved slowly. This was expected. Cross-border investigations involving historic cases rarely move quickly. But the renewed focus marked something important. The case was no longer drifting. It was active again, directed. Whether this direction would lead to resolution remained unknown, but it represented progress in a case long defined by stasis. The distinction between what is known and what is alleged remained critical. Authorities were clear about this boundary. They emphasized that investigation does not equal conviction. That belief does not replace evidence. That time does not erase the need for proof. This clarity helped ground the case in reality rather than speculation. The story entered yet another phase. Not closure, not certainty, but renewed attention shaped by experience. What followed would determine whether that attention could finally bring answers, or whether the case would return once more to quiet waiting. As renewed investigation continued, clarity became increasingly important. Not clarity of outcome, but clarity of boundaries. In a case shaped by time, speculation, and public debate, investigators worked carefully to distinguish between what could be confirmed and what remained unresolved. This distinction mattered because over years of attention, layers of assumption had settled over the facts. Part of the renewed effort involved separating those layers. What could be stated with certainty? What could not? Certain elements of the case remained unchanged since the beginning. Madeleine McCann disappeared from her family's holiday apartment on the evening of May 3rd, 2007. She had been seen asleep earlier that evening. Later, she was found missing. Searches conducted immediately after her disappearance did not locate her. Those facts were not in dispute. They formed the foundation of every subsequent inquiry. Beyond that foundation, certainty thinned. The precise moment of disappearance could not be fixed. No witness saw Madeleine leave the apartment. No confirmed sighting placed her elsewhere afterward. The absence itself remained the central feature of the case. Renewed investigations did not alter this reality. What they changed was context. Authorities clarified that certain conclusions drawn in public discourse had never been formally established. For example, no definitive evidence has been released publicly that confirms the exact manner of Madeleine's disappearance. Statements made by investigators regarding belief or likelihood were carefully framed. Belief did not equate to proof. Similarly, individuals discussed publicly as suspects were described within legal boundaries. Investigators emphasized repeatedly that naming a person of interest does not constitute a charge. No conviction has been secured in relation to Madeleine's disappearance. legal standards remain high. Evidence must meet specific thresholds. This restraint was deliberate. After years of speculation, investigators sought to ground the case in verifiable information. They released details cautiously. They avoided sensationalism. They acknowledged uncertainty where it existed. This approach reflected lessons learned earlier in the case. Public pressure can distort understanding. Premature conclusions can harm investigation. Clarity, even when it offers no resolution, is preferable to assumption. At this stage, authorities describe the case as active, not cold, not closed, active. This designation mattered. It meant that information was still being assessed, that leads were still being followed, that resources remained allocated. But it also meant that progress was incremental. No dramatic announcement marked this phase. Instead, updates arrived occasionally. Statements were brief. Investigators reiterated what they could say and what they could not. Public expectation remained difficult to manage. After years of waiting, many hoped renewed focus would bring swift answers. Investigators tempered those expectations. They explained that historic cases require patience, that evidence degrades over time, that memories shift, that legal processes are deliberate. This honesty was not always satisfying, but it was necessary. As the case stood, several truths coexisted. Madeleine's disappearance remained unexplained. Investigators believed they understood more than they had before, but understanding did not yet translate into resolution. The case existed between belief and proof, between theory and evidence. This space is uncomfortable. It resists narrative. It offers no simple conclusion. For the family, this ambiguity was not new. It had defined their experience for years. Each phase of investigation brought renewed attention and renewed uncertainty. Each statement raised hope and required restraint. As time continued, the case's status remained unchanged in one crucial respect. No definitive answer had been established. No full account of what happened on that evening had been confirmed. The disappearance remained unresolved, and yet it was not forgotten. The renewed focus demonstrated that. The ongoing cooperation between authorities showed that. The careful language used in public statements reflected a commitment to accuracy. The story, long defined by noise and debate, had settled into something quieter, more measured, more careful. This did not mean it had reached an ending, only that it had reached its present. What lay ahead would depend on evidence yet unseen, or information yet shared. For now, the case stood exactly where it had learned to stand. Open, active, unresolved,